The courtroom was packed with whispers and cold glares, every sound swallowed by the weight of judgment. A young black girl stood at the center, small against the towering presence of a strict judge known for his unforgiving sentences. His gavel tapped once, echoing like thunder against the wooden walls, commanding silence. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as the child's trembling hands gripped the edge of the table. Everyone expected tears or apologies, but instead, her lips parted and a single sentence slipped out. The judge froze mid-motion, the lawyers fell silent, and even the jury held their breath. She whispered, "I am hungry." Her name was Amara. Just 12 years old, yet her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had fought battles far beyond her years. She came from a forgotten neighborhood on the edge of town, a place where streetlights flickered out long ago and corner stores sold more liquor than food. Her mother worked 2 jobs, her father had disappeared before she learned to walk, and survival was never guaranteed. Hunger was not just an occasional struggle, it was a daily shadow that followed her to school, to bed, and now even into a courtroom. This courtroom was infamous in her town. It belonged to Judge Harrington, a man whose name sent fear through families. He was known for his rigid interpretation of the law, his cold detachment, and his tendency to punish rather than listen. To him, cases were numbers and faces were files. And yet today, before him stood a child who was barely more than skin and bones, accused of theft in a local store. But what most people did not know was how Amara ended up there. Teachers had written her off as trouble, neighbors whispered about her family's struggles, and officials ignored the signs of poverty that had long defined her life. When food stamps ran out, when free lunch tickets disappeared in the shuffle of paperwork, Amara was left with nothing but gnawing hunger. Now she stood on trial for stealing a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. The room was not only about to witness a legal proceeding, it was about to witness a collision between cruelty and compassion. The girl's fragile presence would soon reveal more about justice, inequality, and humanity than any law book ever could. The trial began with a practiced rhythm. The prosecutor, a man in a polished suit, stood tall and confident. He spoke of law and order, of protecting businesses from theft, of setting examples so that crime would not go unchecked. He painted Amara not as a hungry child, but as a calculated thief who must learn consequences. Every word was carefully chosen, every gesture designed to please the judge. On the other side, Amara sat quietly with a court-appointed attorney who looked tired and unprepared. His files were thin, his arguments rushed. It was clear that Amara's defense was little more than a formality. The system had already stacked the odds against her. Witnesses were called. The store clerk testified how he caught her slipping bread into her worn-out backpack. He exaggerated, describing her as bold and unremorseful, ignoring the tears that had streamed down her face when he grabbed her arm. Another official spoke about community standards and how children must be disciplined before they grow into bigger problems. The words stung, reducing her existence to a future statistic. The gallery watched closely. Some nodded in agreement, some whispered their disapproval, but very few saw the child in front of them. To most, she was just another case file. A black girl from the wrong side of town. Trouble waiting to happen. As the hours passed, Amara's small shoulders seemed to shrink further under the weight of accusations. She fidgeted with her sleeves, her stomach growling audibly in the silence, though no one seemed to notice. Her attorney muttered something about poverty and hardship, but the words were drowned out by the force of the prosecution's voice. The judge's face remained stone-like, his eyes fixed on Amara with a mix of sternness and indifference. He was known for his lack of mercy, and already the outcome seemed certain. A lecture, a punishment, perhaps even detention. But what no one had anticipated was that Amara herself would break the silence. Not with defiance, not with tears, but with words so raw they would slice through the courtroom's cold facade. The rising tension was not in the arguments of lawyers or the pounding of gavels. It was in the quiet rumbling of an empty stomach, the quiet suffering of a child ignored by a world that prided itself on law but failed at compassion. The breaking point was near. The tension was suffocating. And soon, one sentence would collapse the carefully constructed walls of indifference. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as if preparing to deliver his judgment. The courtroom hushed, everyone waiting for the sound of the gavel that would seal Amara's fate. Her attorney looked down at his papers, defeated before the words were even spoken. But then, before the judge could speak, Amara raised her head. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried with astonishing clarity through the courtroom. "I am hungry." The words were simple, almost fragile, yet they hit like a thunderclap. The prosecutor froze mid-step. The clerk who had testified shifted uneasily. The judge himself blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. The room fell into complete silence, every eye locked on the trembling child who had spoken not of law, not of guilt, but of survival. Her small hands gripped the wooden table, her knuckles pale. She repeated it once more, softer this time, "I am hungry." The words carried more weight than any legal argument. They exposed the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. This was not about theft, it was about a system that allowed children to starve. It was about a society where race, poverty, and neglect intertwined to push a child into desperation. The silence in the courtroom grew unbearable. The judge, known for his coldness, looked down at her with something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not pity, not yet compassion, but hesitation. For the first time in his long career, the script had been broken. He could no longer hide behind laws and precedents. The humanity of a starving child stood before him, undeniable. In that moment, the courtroom was transformed. Not by legal arguments, not by authority, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of hunger. What happened next would linger in the memories of all who were present. The judge sat motionless, his gavel still in his hand but suddenly powerless. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably, their rehearsed lines meaningless in the face of such raw honesty. The gallery whispered, but none dared to speak loudly. Everyone had been struck by the uncomfortable truth that justice was not being served, compassion was not being shown, and society itself had failed this child long before she ever walked into that courtroom. The judge eventually cleared his throat, but no stern lecture followed. Instead, his words faltered. He called for a recess, an unusual act for a man who prided himself on efficiency. It was as if he needed time not to consider the law, but to wrestle with his own conscience. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the courtroom. Newspapers reported it with dramatic headlines. Some criticized the system, others demanded reforms, while a few dismissed it as a child's manipulation. Yet those who had sat in that room knew better. They had witnessed a truth so undeniable it pierced through prejudice and procedure alike. Amara's words were not just a cry for food, they were a mirror held up to society. A reminder that laws without compassion are hollow, and justice without humanity is injustice itself. The trial was no longer about bread and milk, it was about whether a community could allow its children to starve and still call itself fair. The case faded with time, as most news does. But the memory of that silent courtroom and that trembling voice lingered. And for many who were there, it changed the way they saw justice, race, and responsibility. And now, as you hear this story, ask yourself, if a child stood before you and whispered, "I am hungry," would you cling to the law, or would you answer with humanity?